I'm going to just dive right in here.
Please take it away.
With Esther. Esther, the world over, we've heard about the pandemic hitting women economically the hardest. I wondered if you could give us a scale here, what we're talking about. I wonder if you could describe how the pandemic has impacted women who reside in the Apec member countries, starting perhaps with Southeast Asia. Or the region generally. What has the pandemic done to their ability to earn a living? What's it done in terms of forcing them out of the workforce altogether or to the sidelines compared to men?
Absolutely. Well, it's been much harder on women than men. And I think that's been around the world. We've seen the impacts on the informal sector. For example, you can't work from home. You don't have a computer. You don't have a place to take your work where you're safe and can be away from others. So because more women work in the informal sector, they were hit harder. Women still bear most of the child caring responsibilities around the world. And so we saw in the US that millions of women quit their jobs when schools closed because someone had to stay home with the children, and it mostly ended up being the mom. UNCDF did a survey of in 2020 of small businesses in the least developed countries. We got responses from every one of the 46 least developed countries. And so we have kind of a special sample into how the pandemic affected women entrepreneurs. And many of these are very small businesses with 1 to 5 employees. And in our survey, we had 73% of our respondents say that they were a business owned or led by a woman entrepreneur. 9 out of 10 reported they were operating at less than 75% of their normal business capacity due to lockdown restrictions. 69.1% reported substantial disruption to their business operations and operating at less than half their normal capacity. And of the effects, we found that COVID-19 had very unequal impact on certain populations and business profiles, including women-led businesses. So our analysis showed that women-led businesses had relatively fewer resources and higher rates of layoffs compared to male-led businesses. 39.5% of the female-led businesses in our survey reported that they were at risk of shutting down within 3 months or less, compared to 29% of the male-led ones. And 36.9% of female-led SMEs reported having to lay off staff, while the comparable figure was 28.2% for male-led businesses. So you see that even at the entrepreneur level, small business people and business people who are running their own businesses, there was an uneven impact on women versus men.
How many women are we talking about losing their jobs, say in the APEC member countries? How many are forced to stay home? It's got to be in the many, many millions.
Yeah, many millions. I'm sorry, I don't have a specific number here, but we know in the U.S. there was, more than. I don't want to guess because I don't have the correct number, but we know that.
Yeah. No, we know what?
We know that the burden of care for children and the home falls disproportionately on women, and that women, generally speaking, are the lower earning partner. And so when push comes to shove and someone has to stay home with the children, it's the women who do it. So we know that there's been greatly unequal impact there.
There was much made about how much progress had been made pre-pandemic in terms of lifting people out of poverty globally. Could you give us a sense of how this has really set us back, and how many years it may take to regain?
Absolutely. So in January 2022, there will be a conference called the LDC 5. This is the 5th 10-year conference for the least developed countries. And before the pandemic hit, the expectation was that most of the Southeast Asian least developed countries, so Cambodia, Laos, Nepal, Myanmar, would be moving quite steadily towards graduation. Bangladesh, for example. These countries are all doing very well economically. They've made great progress on poverty eradication. And they had already moved through some of the kind of checks and gates needed to be certified by the United Nations as no longer a least developed country, but a lower middle income country. So they're making very steady progress. And even despite the pandemic impacts, many of the Southeast Asian least developed countries are likely to reach middle income country status by 2030. The sub-Saharan African ones, no chance. So the pandemic has really devastated many of these countries, which were making steady gains, not as dramatic as Southeast Asia, but really steady gains. But the pandemic has really set that back. And so I would say the gains in poverty eradication that we saw pretty much since 2010 that really gave us hope that some of these goals could be met before 2030 were devastated by the pandemic. Just as one statistic, foreign direct investment in sub-Saharan LDCs dropped by 40% in 2020. And that's hard currency, that's money that these countries really need to move forward. And so the economy has shut down, you have lockdowns, much of your economy is informal, so people are earning less money, they're spending less money. And then the investment that you need from overseas in hard currency to come in and get your economy going has also dropped by more than half. So the tools the government has, which are already limited to fight poverty, are cut even further.
Tell us about what the UN Capital Development Fund has been able to do to provide help to women. In concrete terms, what have you been able to do in the 46 countries that you talk about, the least developed countries?
Absolutely.
Private sector finance work. What's been accomplished?
So we focused on two areas. One was on supporting small and medium enterprises in these countries and making sure they didn't go out of business. So UNCDF has a division called the Least Developed Countries Investment Platform, where we make loans and guarantees directly to small and medium enterprises in the least developed countries. And most of these are very small businesses. We're making loans up to a couple of $100,000. So they're pretty, early stage anyway. We immediately put a payment holiday on all the loans. So we told everyone during the pandemic, you don't have to make payments. We'll just hold your credit, get yourselves going, make sure that your business is in good shape, and then we'll talk with you again about when you start paying back. So that was really a lifeline for many of the businesses that we support. We pushed out grant money much faster. So we accelerated our grant making process, and our donors were quite flexible and really wonderful about this, where we said, can we just take this money that we were going to use for some project that we can't do now and move it out faster so that governments can use it? And in every case, they said yes. We made block grants to local governments so that they could start buying things like PPE and disinfecting hospitals and taking care of their immediate needs before the money could come from their own government, or if their own government didn't have enough money. So UNCDF really took the resources that we had, and just accelerated everything starting in March 2020 to make sure that our clients, both local governments, individuals, and then small businesses in the least developed countries would get through it, would survive the immediate shock.
So, and what is the scale of the money you can actually push out the door?
So last year we did $85 million of development assistance. This year our budget's a little bit higher, so we're hoping to move more money out the door. It's a drop in the bucket against the $130 billion of international official development assistance, but it certainly helps. And especially in these places where, someone needs a $10,000 loan to make it for the next 6 months, it makes a difference.
So lots of this stuff is micro. This is micro lending, basically.
It's not as small as micro lending. Microfinance tends to be a couple $100, $50, so someone can buy a goat. This is a little bit bigger. It's a business, and mostly they're cash flow positive, but they're not big enough or established enough to get support from banks. So our support as a UN agency coming in, helping them, say, build a business plan, put their management team in place, get everything ready, will give them maybe a grant and then a concessional loan. And then after they've paid all those things back and gone through that process, they can go to a bank and a bank will give them a loan.
Esther, have you seen programs to advance the economic fortunes of women, or at least protect the fortunes of women in this pandemic, in this vast region that spans Apec? What government, business, NGO tie-ups have you seen that work? What's a good example of something to emulate? Is one country sort of a standout? Who should we be watching?
I think we should definitely be watching Bangladesh. So one example that I know of is the Better Than Cash Alliance, which is the secretariat sits at UNCDF, but this is an international alliance of businesses and governments working to digitize cash payments. They had been working in Bangladesh to talk with the government about digitizing payments to garment workers, because when women receive their pay in cash, they take it home, give it to their whole family, and they don't have necessarily savings options or ways to invest money. So the Better Than Cash Alliance is helping both governments and big companies like H&M and The Gap digitize their payment systems so that A, they know the money gets to the worker, and B, then the worker has a safe place to store it and then maybe some investment options, or she can put it in a bank and earn interest on it. So they had started doing this process in Bangladesh. And then when the pandemic hit, the government decided that all garment workers were going to be paid digitally. And they put a pandemic relief payment out through this mechanism. So the government essentially, I think it was in 2 months, it was something really fast, said to everybody in the country, your workers need to be digitized right now so we can get this pandemic support money out to them. And they did it. And Colombia, the same. They were able to push out pandemic support payments through digital means. So I think those are two great examples of, the groundwork had been laid, the governments had been looking at these solutions, but then the pandemic just made everybody act faster. And they did.
What kind of business is actually interested in uplifting the lives economically of economically deprived women? Who really is rolling up their sleeves now, Esther, and saying, here's an opportunity to do well and to do good? Who are these businesses? Where are
I would say the businesses that are part of the Better Than Cash Alliance, right? They've signed on to this global alliance where they have to report on the digitization of the payments to the workers in their supply chain. So that's H&M, Zara, I believe Gap is in it. There are private sector entities, in fashion, as well as governments. So there are many governments that are signed up to this initiative as well. So I would say, judge the businesses by what they're doing, right? AB InBev, we know well that they are really forward-leaning on putting together environmental plans, water-saving plans. They're so committed to setting goals by 2025 that they started an in-house venture capital accelerator to support companies that could help them achieve their own goals. So they said, we need to save water and use non-toxic cleaning solutions in our bottling factories. Nobody does that, so we're going to start a company and seed it and give them a contract to do that for our own solutions. So I think things like that, when you see that companies, they're not just putting out a report, they're not just talking about their commitments, they are actually changing the way they do business and investing in solutions or shifts that will have an impact that they can demonstrate. I think those are the ones that are doing a good job.
Esther, are there any post-pandemic reforms that would allow a sizable number of women to remain in their home and be gainfully employed there? That would seem to be one of the more optimal setups.
Well, and this is a challenge, Julie, that we've been dealing with since the SDGs, where the idea of unpaid care work came up, right? That there's this burden of unpaid care of elderly people, family, getting water, cooking, that falls so disproportionately on women. It keeps them out of the workforce, and it limits their ability to take paid work and progress in careers with paid work. So I know in the US there's been talk about, Marshall Plan for moms and recognizing women. I don't know, in this last infrastructure plan, I didn't follow it closely to see if anything did go through for caregivers or paid maternity leave or paid paternity leave. The US tends to be really lagging behind other countries on areas that support mothers, for example. The US has no official policy on paid maternity leave. So I think things like that, things that will start to recognize women's unpaid care work, things that make it easier for women to balance their paid work versus their unpaid care work. For example, in France and other European countries, there's a very strong network of nurseries. So when you have a child, they have a place in a nursery. It's close to your house. You can drop them off at 10 months or 24 months or whatever your very generous maternity leave ends. And you know that the government will help you provide childcare for your family so that you can work and also come home. And in countries like the United States, where we don't have that kind of safety net, we saw that the safety net was moms. They quit their jobs and they stayed home to take care of their children. And that has a very damaging impact on their economic futures.
I remember very interesting estimates of what it would cost when I was living in India, what it would cost to actually pay domestic workers who come into homes throughout India, middle-class homes, a living wage. Their wages are very extremely low, with the goal of creating a more equitable society. And the numbers were quite sobering to the Indian middle class, and not something many were very interested in. And it's that same question of really fundamentally deeply underpaid labor, and how you go about addressing that. And I guess, as we look at these partnerships between business and NGOs and government, it seems to me, Esther, and I'd like you to comment on this, that the governments have to lead, because without a legal framework that protects women, provides consequences if those protections are not met, their rights are violated. I mean, these sorts of ventures seem rather toothless tigers. What can we really hope to accomplish here without sort of deepening the whole rights regime for women?
Yeah, I think that's really a key part of it. And in the United States, there's a group called the Domestic Workers Alliance, which has been working very hard to get recognition and rights for people like nannies and caregivers and elder caregivers who tend to be, the least recognized, lowest paid, most easily abused. I think it's a real challenge. I think the government does need to set a regulatory framework that protects women, but the work that these women do is not valued. And that's why they are able to be paid so little. And that's why they are able to be taken advantage of so easily. So how is there a way to structure society so that this work is valued and is paid accordingly? Same way for teachers, same way for nurses, right? There's so many kinds of work that women do that is taken for granted almost, that, when women enter an industry, like they become pediatricians, the mean pay of the pediatricians drops and it becomes less prestigious because now it's women doing it. So I think these are all tied up with all of these things, right? It's normative ways that people view women's work. It's the pay that women receive for jobs that are primarily done by women. It's the way society views things like childcare or education of very small children or taking care of elderly people who are vulnerable. It's all of these things. And government can do one part. They can try to set rules and regulations and, try to set a minimum wage or something. But the way these women are treated and the way the wages that they earn reflect the value that society puts on their work. So that's also something we need to change in order to make their lives better.
Esther, what do you see Apec able to do? How can it ensure, for example, equal pay among women in its member states? Even if we're talking about just its member states. What is the role of Apec in ensuring basically a more equitable society, ensuring a more healthy, resilient society?
I think APEC and kind of these multinational groups are really for standard setting, right? They're for saying, like, we as a group of countries believe that XYZ, they're good at kind of having statements of values or policy goals that they're going towards. Like, we as APEC pledge to, reach the SDGs or achieve SDG 5 or something like that. I think at that level, it's very difficult to ensure that people will get paid equally, right? You can say, member states, here are some suggestions about, frameworks or laws or, compliance mechanisms that have helped this member state reach closer to parity. I don't think anybody has pay parity anywhere. I'd be surprised if Norway does. I think, we've really seen these very persistent wage gaps because of the type of work that women do versus men, and the fact that more women take time out to take care of children or elderly people. And then when they come back into the market, there's no way they can make up the wages. So I think at an APEC level or a multinational level, you can set standards. You could try to push towards, universalizing everyone's achievement of those standards, but really changing the impact on that woman on the ground who has a job is much harder. And it involves all these other issues we were talking about.
There is a question from the audience, and the question is, as you can see there, Esther, do these workers have internet access generally? I suppose these workers may be the Bangladeshi workers we were talking about who would be digitally paid by their garment factories.
So that's a great question. We've found that in least developed countries, there's a massive, what's it called? The word for,
digital divide.
There's a massive digital divide. That's true. There is one, but also there's very strong usage of devices. Because if you don't have a home phone, if you don't have an internet line at your house, you're going to get it on your cell phone. Everyone has a cell phone everywhere. And you can buy prepaid cards that give you cell phone access. So $1 at a time, $10 at a time. And when I was studying in South Africa, for example, people thought that cell phones would not take off there because in the developed world, they were something for upper middle class. Cell phones took off like wildfire among the working poor because they don't have a fixed address. They're never going to get a phone. They spend all their time on buses. And so they're the ones who need to be able to be in touch with people all the time. And you could go to any gas station, buy a card, scratch off the code, put some money on your phone, and then use it until it ran out. right? So you could put very small bits of money on your phone. And so we find that, workers everywhere have cell phones, and people are finding their way into Facebook and WhatsApp. So they do have access. And then when you connect their digital access for, whatever they're using for now to some kind of banking solution or investment solution, they'll use it.
We've got a couple more minutes, about 3 more minutes, I think. I have 2 more questions. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the great diversity in the economies that exist in Apec. Very poor, very rich. There has to be some advantage to that, to having that great sort of mix in the kind of experimentation that the world is now undergoing as it tries to push equality for women. I wonder if you could talk about that.
Yes.
That great diversity of
Absolutely. So, I think it's a great advantage to have very developed economies and less developed economies in the same pool, right? Because then at least you have a hub where everyone can go work, and then they're sending money home. So there's a strong stream of remittances. You have more resilience because it's not all informal agricultural based economies. For example, you have different sectors that are strong at any one time. And then countries can learn from each other. And we found that there's a lot of sharing on policy, on frameworks, on guidelines across countries and between countries. So Singapore could teach Laos something about banking regulations, but Laos could teach Singapore something about reaching poor rural workers, right? So there are a lot of lessons that countries learn by solving problems in their own situation. And if they are in a network that has kind of diversity within it, they're learning different things. And so the fact that they can share lessons among themselves is very valuable.
I'm going to make an observation and one last question. Much of this, for me, drives home a fundamental question that I asked myself as I was watching the climate change talks, and that is, does the world really want equality? We are talking about, for 25 years, the whole debate was about how the developing world was going to be helped by the developed world. And now there's billions of dollars about remediation and how we will help them that hasn't really been raised. And now more money is being asked. And then the question occurred to me, does the world really want this? And the same question, I sort of raises itself to me in these kinds of ventures. But what I hear you saying, Esther, is that you really feel that the arc is bending toward a more just world for women, and that the trajectory for women, it's a long, slow one, but it may be upward. Am I correct?
Yes, absolutely. And I see that in my own life, that I have so many opportunities that my mother never had, that my grandmother certainly never had. My children will have more opportunities than I had. So I do think it's changing. It's changing slower than we'd like, but we're seeing tremendous progress around the world on all of these issues, climate, inequality, poverty. We are seeing progress. It's not as fast as we would like, but we have to keep moving forward because that's what we do. We can't just give up. There's so many people depending on us. And we know that, for every woman who gets a CEO spot, every woman who joins a board, every woman who gets a job, every woman who pays for another girl to go to school, that's progress. That's progress that would not have happened in the past. And all of the women who are working today know or should know that they enjoy professional success because the women before us paved the way. They went on strike. They took secretarial jobs. They accepted all the insults and everything that was so shocking and terrible so that we could have this spot, right? They weren't doing it for themselves, they were doing it for the people after them. So I'm very confident in the future because I know that we enjoy the status and the success that we have now because of the sacrifices women and men have made in the past. And I know that the generations after us will do better because of the actions that we're taking now.
Thank you, Esther Pan Sloane.
Thank you, Julie.